The Necromancer along with the Druid will be unlocked in this week's Diablo 4 open beta test. In this video, I want to review 3 sample build options for the Necromancer which could be interesting to check out during the open beta. As the Necromancer and Druid are my top 2 candidates to main, make sure to subscribe to this channel if you're interested in seeing more content around these 2 classes. As a quick disclaimer, this video is going to be using a character who is level 50. In the beta, we're currently capped at level 25 with the potential for 27 or 28 skill points depending on how hard you go. The main purpose of this is to show general build concepts or themes rather than what the best beta build will be. Even though our characters will be capped at level 25 in the beta, you will still be able to get a decent feel for how each build works. I will include links in the description for both level 25 and level 50 builds for reference. Let's quickly check out what the Necromancer is all about. This class is interesting because it's a very involved pet class. As the class name implies, you utilize the dead in various ways. The class mechanic is called Book of the Dead, which allows you to summon various skeletal soldiers, which can be further customized. There are 3 different categories of soldiers, each with 3 variations for a total of 9 potential summons. While each summon has its own unique talent options, you can even choose to forego summoning them, and these soldiers will instead provide buffs for yourself, turning you into a one-man army. Now let's get into our first build, which is called the Bone Shaper. This build utilizes bone skills, as you might imagine, which are primarily focused on dealing critical strikes to maintain resources and dish out damage. For our basic skills, we're going to be taking Bone Splinters. This is just going to cause you to fire 3 splinters made of bone that are going to deal a little bit of damage per splinter. Each subsequent time that an enemy is hit by a bone splinter, you gain 1 additional essence. The base value that you generate is 5, so if you hit an enemy with any additionals, you'll gain 2 more, so for a total of 7 essence. When this is enhanced, Bone Splinters has a 30% chance to fire 2 additional projectiles if you're casting Bone Splinters when you have 50 or more essence. And for Acolyte's Bone Splinters, hitting the same enemy enough times with a single cast of Bone Splinters grants you additional critical strike for so many seconds. Moving into our core skill, we're going to be taking Bone Spear. This is going to conjure a Bone Spear from the ground, dealing a lot of damage and piercing through enemies. When Bone Spear is enhanced, it causes Bone Spear to break into extra shards, which are going to deal extra damage. And then finally, with Supernatural Bone Spear, this is going to make the first enemy that you're hitting with Bone Spear vulnerable for a few seconds. There are a few passives here. Unliving Energy, which is going to just increase your maximum essence by 3. We're just going to take 1 point in that. And then we're going to take 3 points in the talent after that. That's imperfectly balanced. This is going to make your core skills cost a little bit more essence, but deal 30% increased damage. I'm not entirely sold on this. This is something that I want to try out, and there might be better options once we kind of get playing. For our Macabre skill, we're going to be taking Bone Prison. This is going to cause a ring of bones to surround a target location, and that prison will last for 6 seconds. When Bone Prison is enhanced, if an enemy is trapped by Bone Prison, you generate 3 essence plus some additional essence per enemy trapped. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, with Ghastly Bone Prison, enemies who are inside of Bone Prison become vulnerable. Next, we're moving into our corruption skills, and here we're going to be taking Decrepify. This is going to curse a targeted area, causing the Decrepified targets to become slowed and deal 25% less damage for 10 seconds. With Enhanced Decrepify, enemies hit while affected by Decrepify have up to a 10% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds. And then finally, we have Horrid Decrepify, which is when you or your minions hit an enemy afflicted by Decrepify below 10%. They are instantly killed, but this does not work on bosses. And finally, there's a passive effect in here that we're going to be taking, which is Amplified Damage, where you deal 9% increased damage to cursed enemies. Now into our summoning section, this is what I imagine a lot of our burst damage is going to come from, and this is Bone Spirit. Bone Spirit will consume all of your essence that you have at the time of casting, and is going to deal a large amount of upfront damage, but that damage is further increased by 3% for each point of essence spent casting Bone Spirit. This can then be enhanced to if Bone Spirit critically strikes, its cooldown is reduced by 6 seconds. This is cutting the cooldown in half if it critically strikes. And then finally, with Ghastly Bone Spirit has an additional 10% crit chance. So naturally, this crit strike should help out with that cooldown reduction to get more of that burst off. And next we have Serration, and this is going to make it so that your bone skills have a 1.5% increased critical strike chance for each 10 essence that you have upon cast. So I assume that that's further going to enhance your Bone Spirit to give it more critical strike chance. And then there's also Compound Fracture, which is after critically striking 10 times with bone skills, your bone skills deal 12% increased damage for 5 seconds. And then for our ultimate, we're just going to be taking 1 point in Bone Storm for now. This just causes a storm of bone, dealing damage to enemies surrounding you for 10 seconds. And finally for our capstone, we have Ossified Essence. This is going to make your bone skills deal 1% increased damage for each point of essence you have above 50 upon cast. For our Book of the Dead in this build, we are going to be sacrificing our skeletal warriors, specifically the skirmishers. This is going to give us 5% crit chance. And then for the skeletal mages, we're actually going to be using the cold mages and the first upgrade for them. This is going to give it so that anytime your cold mage attacks with their primary attack, you're going to generate 2 essence. So this really just helps with our resource generation and fueling our bone spirit a little bit more. And finally for the golem, we are going to be sacrificing the iron golem because this is going to give us 30% critical strike damage. This is just synergizing with our high critical strike chance already. Now, very quickly, I just want to go over some of the legendary effects that I think would synergize pretty well with this build. The first is a utility effect to generate resources, and this is Aspect of Torment. This is going to make it so that your critical strikes with bone skills increases your essence regeneration by 20% for 4 seconds. And then for a little bit more of an offensive option, I think Aspect of Swelling Curse might be pretty solid. This is going to cause your bone spirit to deal increased damage based on the distance it travels up to 15%, essentially just investing more into that bone spirit skill. For the Paragon board, we're not going to have access to this in the beta, of course, but this is basically making it so that as you hit enemies with your bone skills, you're increasing your damage and also your maximum essence for a little bit up to a cap. This basically just gives a passive damage increase, but also increases your resources, which means that you can invest more of your essence into your bone spirit to have it deal more burst damage. For our second build, we are investing completely into our Army of the Dead. This build utilizes some damage over time effects, which increases the damage you and your minions do to those targets affected by your dots. For our basic skill, we're going to be taking Decompose. This is a channeled effect, I think, that causes you to deal a little bit of damage per second channeled, and it forms a usable corpse with the flesh every 2.5 seconds that this is channeled. When Decompose is enhanced, any enemy that dies while being decomposed, you gain 10 essence. And finally, for Acolyte's Decompose, you and your minions deal 10% increased damage to enemies who are decomposed. For our core skills, we're going to be taking Blight, which is going to cause a damage over time pool to be dropped, and it's going to deal a lot of damage over 6 seconds. When this is enhanced, enemies who are affected by Blight will be slowed by 25%. And finally, with Supernatural Blight, you and your minions deal 10% increased damage to enemies within Blight. The passive effect that we're taking here is Hewed Flesh. This is going to make it so that on a lucky hit, you have a chance to create a corpse at a target's location, and this chance is doubled against bosses. Moving into our Macabre skills, we're going to be taking Corpse Explosion. This causes a corpse to explode, dealing a large amount of damage to surrounding enemies. When this is enhanced, it just increases the corpse explosion radius, but more importantly, with Blighted Corpse Explosion, it's going to cause Corpse Explosion to become a darkness skill, which is relevant to some of our passives, and instead of exploding, it's going to release a pool of miasma, which is going to deal extra shadow damage over so many seconds. There are 2 passives here that we're taking. The first is Grim Harvest, which is consuming a corpse generates 3 essence, but more importantly, Fueled by Death is going to make it so that anytime you consume a corpse, your damage is going to be increased by 12% for 4 seconds. Moving into the Corruption, we have a lot of investment on this tree. Starting out, we have Iron Maiden, and this is going to curse a targeted area, and enemies affected by Iron Maiden will take 10% damage anytime they deal direct damage. That includes damage to your pets or damage to you. When we enhance Iron Maiden, this makes it so that it no longer costs essence, and instead you generate essence for each enemy cursed. With Horrid Iron Maiden, when at least 3 enemies are afflicted by Iron Maiden, its damage is increased by 15%. We also invest into Decrepify, which is going to cause us to curse a targeted area, afflicting enemies with Decrepify, which slows them by 50% and makes them deal 25% less damage for 10 seconds. We then enhance Decrepify so that on lucky hits, enemies afflicted with Decrepify have a chance to be stunned. And with Horrid Decrepify, when you or your minions hit an enemy afflicted with Decrepify below 10%, they are instantly killed. The 2 passives that we're investing in here are Amplify Damage. This causes us to deal 9% increased damage to cursed enemies. And then we also have Skeletal Mage Mastery, which is going to increase the damage and life of your skeletal mages by 45%. Now into our summoning tree, we're going to be putting 1 point into Corpse Tendril. This causes a vein to burst from a corpse, pulling in enemies and stunning them for 3 seconds and dealing a little bit of damage to them. When Corpse Tendrils is enhanced, it causes enemies within range of the tendrils to be slowed by 50% before being pulled in. And finally, with Plagued Corpse Tendrils, this causes enemies damaged by Corpse Tendrils to be made vulnerable. The few passes that we're taking here is Reaper's Pursuit. This causes enemies damage with darkness skills to increase your movement speed by 5% for 3 seconds. And then we also take Gloom, which is whenever you damage an enemy with a darkness skill, they take increased shadow damage from you and your minions for 2 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. We're actually going to skip taking any of our ultimates here. And then finally for our capstone, we're going to be taking Shadow Blight. This makes it so that shadow damage infects enemies with Shadow Blight for 2 seconds. And this makes it so that you and your enemies deal 10% bonus damage to enemies with Shadow Blight. And then every 20th time an enemy receives shadow damage by you or a minion, while they're affected by Shadow Blight, they take additional shadow damage. Now for the Book of the Dead, our Skeletal Warriors, we're going to be investing in the Skeletal Skirmishers, and we're going to be taking the first upgrade for them, allowing us to raise an additional skirmisher. For mages, I'm between two, either the Shadow Mage or the Bone Mage. I might mess around with both of these, but for now I'm going to say the Shadow Mages with their second upgrade, which causes them to fire an additional Shadow Bolt every 6th attack. If we were going to invest in the Bone Mages, I would probably take the first upgrade because this is going to give them a sizable damage increase once they've been alive for at least 5 seconds. Although it is important to note that your Bone Mages, whenever they attack, they consume some of their life, so they're not infinitely going to have that 40% damage increase. They are eventually going to kill themselves. And then lastly, for the golems, we are going to be taking the Bone Golem, which is going to be our tank, and it's going to taunt enemies. This just helps keep our army alive, and each time your golem takes up to 20% of its maximum life as damage, it's going to shed a corpse. For our legendaries, there is Aspect of Reanimation. This is going to make it so that your skeletons gain increased damage while alive up to 20% after 10 seconds. But there's also the option for Aspect of the Damned, which is going to increase your shadow damage to enemies who are afflicted by both Decrepify and Iron Maiden. I'm not entirely sure how this Aspect of the Damned is going to work out, but it still sounds like it could work. And this is the main reason why we were taking both Decrepify and Iron Maiden. If we end up not taking Aspect of the Damned, I think we drop maybe Decrepify, and then we can maybe pick up Army of the Damned in its place. And if we were to do that, then we could also take Unyielding Commander's Aspect, which makes it so that while Army of the Dead is active, your minions gain 70% increased attack speed and take 90% reduced damage. This could turn Army of the Dead into a pretty big burst cooldown, but again, this is all kind of just speculation right now. For a Paragon board, I think there are 2 options that we could go with. The first being Wither. This makes it so that your shadow damage over time effects have a % chance to deal increased damage each time they deal damage, and this chance is increased and bonus damage is increased for each willpower you have. The other option we can go into, which more invests into your Skeletal Warriors, is Cult Leader. This makes it so that your minions deal increased damage for each minion type you have active. And for the final build, we're looking at a build which forgoes summons and instead absorbs their power, turning the Necromancer into a juggernaut with a lot of self-sustaining skills. For a basic skill, we are going to look into taking Hemorrhage. This is going to cause an enemy's blood to burst, dealing a little bit of damage, and it has a 20% chance to form a blood orb. Picking up one of these blood orbs will heal you for 15% of your maximum health. When Hemorrhage is enhanced, after picking up a blood orb, your next Hemorrhage also deals damage to enemies around your target and grants 2 additional essence per enemy hit. And finally, with Acolyte's Hemorrhage, Hemorrhage gains an additional 20% attack speed while healthy. For our core skills, we're going to be taking Blood Surge. This causes you to draw in the blood from your enemies, dealing a little bit of damage, but then you expel a pool of blood which deals 50% damage. Expelling that pool of blood, that damage can be increased by 10% per enemy drained up to a maximum of 50%. Enhancing Blood Surge causes you to heal for 1% of your maximum life when drawing blood from enemies. If a threshold of enemies are drawn from, then the heal is increased by a percentage of your maximum health. And finally, for Paranormal Blood Surge, if an enemy is damaged by the Blood Surge Nova, while you're healthy, you gain 1 stack of Overwhelming Blood. When you have 5 stacks of these Overwhelming Blood, your next Blood Surge is guaranteed to overpower. For our Macabre skills, we're going to be taking Blood Mist, which is going to cause the Necromancer become immune to damage for a few seconds. Your move speed is reduced by a certain percentage, and you periodically deal a little bit of damage to enemies and heal for a percentage of your maximum health. This is very much a defensive tool, and when this is enhanced, casting a skill that overpowers will reduce the cooldown of Blood Mist. And with Dreadful Blood Mist will now fortify you for a percentage of your health for each time it hits an enemy. The passive skill we're taking here is Spiked Armor. This is going to give us Thorns, which is going to increase our passive damage For our corruption, we're going to put 1 point into Iron Maiden. This again causes you to curse a target area, afflicting enemies with Iron Maiden so that they take 10% damage each time they deal direct damage to you. And this is then enhanced so that Iron Maiden no longer costs essence, but instead it gains 5 essence for each enemy cursed. And finally, for Abhorrent Iron Maiden, this makes it so that you will heal for 5% of your maximum health anytime an enemy dies afflicted with Iron Maiden. We will then take a passive here for amplified damage, causing us to deal 9% increased damage to cursed enemies. And then moving into our summoning skills, we're going to be taking Corpse Tendrils. This again causes veins to burst out of a corpse, pulling in enemies and stunning them for 3 seconds, dealing a little bit of damage. With Enhanced Corpse Tendrils, enemies who are within the range of those Corpse Tendrils are going to be slowed by 50% before being pulled in. And finally, with Blighted Corpse Tendril has a percentage chance whenever it's dealing damage to drop a Blood Orb. We have a few passives we're going to be taking here. The first is Gruesome Healing. This makes it so that while you're below 50% life, you have a healing received buff. And next we have Coalesce Blood, which is going to make it so that while you're healthy, your blood skills deal a % increased damage. And then finally we have Tides of Blood, which is going to make your blood skills deal 10% increased overpower damage, and this bonus is doubled whenever you're healthy. For our ultimate, we're going to be taking Bone Storm just because it deals quite a bit of damage around us. We're taking 2 passives in this cluster. The first is Standalone. This increases your damage reduction by 12%, but reduces it by 4% for each active minion. And again, since we're sacrificing all of our minions, we should have the full effect of the damage reduction. And finally, with Memento Mori, sacrificing both your Skeletal Warriors and Skeletal Mages increases their sacrifice bonus by 60%. For Capstone, we have Rathma's Vigor. This makes it so that you have an increased maximum life, and after being healthy for 25 seconds, your next blood skill overpowers. And for our last builds, Book of the Dead, we're going to be sacrificing all 3 of our summons. And for the Skeletal Warriors, we're going to be sacrificing the Skeletal Defenders to give us a little bit of damage resistance. For the Skeletal Mages, we're going to be sacrificing the Bone Mages. This is going to increase our overpowered damage by 30%. And we have our Blood Surge, which is going to be guaranteed overpowers every few attacks. And then finally, for the Golem, we're going to be sacrificing the Blood Golem to give us a little bit extra maximum life. I think another alternative I want to mess around with here is the Bone Golem to give us just a little bit of extra attack speed on all of our attacks. Moving into our legendaries, I think there are 3 that kind of stick out, and I'll go in an order of least importance, I think. The first is Bloodbathe aspect. This makes it so that your Blood Surge, the Nova aspect, it will echo after a short delay, dealing 60% less damage. Then next we have Sacrificial aspect, which is going to increase the sacrifice bonus by 15%. And then maybe the best option here, again, this will take some testing, but when you pick up 5 blood orbs, a free bone spirit is spawned, dealing bonus damage based on your current life percentage. I assume that this means that you don't need to be actively spec'd into bone spirit, it just kind of summons it freely. And if you're at maximum health, I assume that that's going to deal some pretty chunky burst. For the Paragon board, I think there are 2 options here. The first is Bloodbath, and this makes it so that attacks that are guaranteed to overpower deal increased overpower damage. Depending on what that number actually is, this would make our Blood Surge deal pretty chunky overpower damage, but I'm not sure how powerful this will actually be compared to the second option, which is Blood Begets Blood. This makes it so that anytime you grab a blood orb, it's going to give you some passive increased damage up to a certain percentage, so it is capped for a few seconds. But that's going to wrap up the Necromancer builds. As usual, let me know which one sounds like the most interesting to you in the comments. Personally, I'm most interested in the one-man army and maybe the bone build. I think for one-man army, it sounds kind of cool just to become this unmovable juggernaut. And for the bone build, getting those really fat, chunky bone spirits to see what kind of burst numbers they can deal. I am just I just love big numbers, so I'm interested to see how big they can get. But we'll have to see how some of this scaling turns out. Anyhow, this is Goober Troy signing off, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the open beta.